when 65-year-old Miranda Blake's own son abandoned her on a rain-soaked highway, declaring she needed a lesson. She had no idea this cruel betrayal would awaken a sleeping lioness. What Nathan thought was punishment became his mother's greatest awakening, transforming a grieving widow into a strategic mastermind who would reclaim her late husband's empire and expose a web of corruption reaching from corporate boardrooms to international crime syndicates. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible story of betrayal, redemption, and a mother's unbreakable will. And please comment below with your city so I can see how far this amazing tale travels around the world. The rain fell like bullets that October night, each drop a sharp reminder that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones who destroy you. I never imagined that at 65 years old, standing on the side of Highway 47 with nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back, I would discover what I was truly made of. My name is Miranda Blake, and this is the story of how my son's cruelest lesson became my greatest liberation. It started 3 hours earlier in what I thought was going to be a routine family dinner at Sinclair Manor, the sprawling estate my late husband Robert had built from nothing, brick by brick, dream by dream. The house still smelled like his cologne, and certain rooms still echoed with his laughter in the hallways. He'd been gone 8 months, and I was still learning how to breathe without him. "Mother, we need to talk." Nathan's voice cut through the silence of the dining room like a blade. At 42, my son had inherited his father's sharp jawline, but none of his warmth. Where Robert's eyes had sparkled with mischief and kindness, Nathan's burned cold and calculating. I looked up from my untouched plate of salmon. I hadn't had much appetite since Robert's funeral. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" He wasn't alone. Victor Kozlov, the company's chief financial officer, stood behind him like a shadow in an expensive suit. Victor had joined Sinclair Motors just 6 months before Robert's heart attack, and something about the man had always made my skin crawl. He had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes and a handshake that lasted a second too long. "It's about your involvement in company matters," Nathan continued, his tone formal, businesslike. "This wasn't my son speaking. This was the CEO of Sinclair Motors, and apparently I was just another problem to be solved. My involvement—" I set down my fork carefully. "Nathan, I've barely asked about the business since your father passed. I've been giving you space to find your footing." "That's not entirely true, is it?" Victor's accent carried the slightest hint of Eastern Europe, though he claimed to be from Chicago. "You've been asking questions, making inquiries about certain financial decisions." My blood chilled. 3 weeks ago, I'd noticed some irregularities in the company's quarterly report that Robert's accountant, Margaret Chen, had quietly brought to my attention. Nothing dramatic, just some numbers that didn't quite add up, some expenditures that seemed unusually high. I'd mentioned it to Nathan in passing, thinking he'd want to know. "I asked about the consulting fees," I said slowly. "They seemed unusually high for a company our size." Nathan and Victor exchanged a look, quick but not quick enough. In that split second, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Guilt, conspiracy, fear. "Mother." Nathan's voice took on that patronizing tone he'd perfected as a teenager. "You're not equipped to understand the complexities of modern business. Father may have built this company, but times have changed. We're operating in a global marketplace now." "Your father understood global markets just fine," I replied, my voice sharper than intended. "He also understood integrity." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victor leaned forward slightly, and I caught a whiff of expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something else, something that reminded me of fear and desperation. "Mrs. Blake," Victor said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, "perhaps it would be best if you focused on your grief. Let the business professionals handle business." I'd been married to Robert Blake for 38 years. In that time, I'd watched him build Sinclair Motors from a small auto repair shop into a regional powerhouse with 3 factories and over 2,000 employees. I'd sat through countless business dinners, absorbed conversations about supply chains and profit margins, learned to read financial statements as easily as grocery lists. The idea that I was some helpless widow who couldn't understand modern business was not just insulting, it was strategically stupid. I see, I said quietly, too quietly. Robert used to say that when I got really angry, I didn't get loud, I got dangerously calm. And these business decisions you're making, they're in the best interest of the company, of the employees who've worked for us for decades. Nathan's jaw tightened. Every decision I make is calculated to ensure Sinclair Motors' future prosperity, even the ones that involve transferring company funds to offshore accounts. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. I'd said them quietly, almost casually, but they hit their target with precision. Nathan went pale. Victor's hand tightened around his wineglass until his knuckles turned white. Margaret Chen had been Robert's accountant for 15 years, and she'd been like family to us. When she'd approached me with her concerns 3 weeks ago, her hands shaking as she showed me the suspicious transactions I'd promised her I would handle it quietly. I'd trusted my son to have a reasonable explanation. Instead, I was looking at two men who looked like they'd been caught with their hands in the cookie jar if the cookie jar contained millions of dollars and the cookies were my late husband's life work. I don't know what Margaret told you, Nathan said, his voice tight, but that woman has been spreading lies and causing problems since Father died. In fact, we're going to have to let her go. Let her go. My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. Margaret's been with us for 15 years. She's practically family. Family doesn't spread malicious rumors, Victor interjected smoothly. Family trusts family. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, the same floor Robert had installed himself when we'd first moved into the house 20 years ago. Mother, I think it's time you understood something. I'm not a child anymore. I'm the CEO of this company, and I make the decisions. If you can't respect that, then what? I stood too, my 5'3" frame dwarfed by my son's 6-foot height, but I'd never felt more powerful. You'll fire me too from my own family. It's not your family anymore, Nathan said, and his words hit me like a physical blow. Father's gone. This is my company now, my legacy to build. And if you can't support me, then maybe you need to learn what it means to have nothing. I stared at my son, really looked at him, and realized I was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. When had the sweet boy who used to bring me dandelions become this cold stranger? When had Robert's son turned into someone Robert wouldn't recognize? Nathan, I said quietly, what would your father say if he could see you right now? Something flickered across his face, pain maybe or guilt, but it was gone so quickly I almost missed it. Father's not here, he said, and it's time you learned to live in the real world. That's when Victor stepped forward and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about money or power. There was something darker here, something that made my instincts scream danger. Mrs. Blake, Victor said, his voice honey smooth and absolutely terrifying, I think perhaps you need some time to reflect on your position. Time to understand what happens when people ask too many questions about things that don't concern them. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I looked between Victor and my son and realized that Nathan was in deeper than just embezzlement. Whatever they were involved in, it was big enough to make them willing to threaten a grieving widow, big enough to make a son betray his own mother. Are you threatening me? I asked quietly. I'm offering you wisdom, Victor replied. In my experience, curiosity can be dangerous, especially for older women living alone in big houses. The casual mention of my living situation, the subtle reminder that I was vulnerable, hit its mark. But instead of fear, I felt something else rising in my chest, something that had been sleeping since Robert's funeral. Rage, pure white-hot rage. Nathan must have seen it in my face because he stepped back slightly. Mother, no one's threatening you. Victor's just saying that it might be better if you took some time, maybe traveled, visited Aunt Sarah in Florida. Got out of the way, you mean? Got some perspective, though, Nathan corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. I looked around the dining room at the family photos on the mantel, at the china cabinet filled with wedding presents, and anniversary gifts, at the portrait of Robert hanging over the fireplace. He was smiling in that picture, proud and strong, his arm around my shoulders, at our 30th anniversary party. Your father built this company with his bare hands. I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions raging inside me. He worked 18-hour days for 20 years to give you a future. He believed in integrity and taking care of his people and building something that would last. Times change, Nathan said dismissively. Father was too sentimental. Your father was a good man. Good men finish last in today's economy. And there it was, the fundamental difference between the man I'd married and the boy I'd raised. Somehow, somewhere I'd failed. Or maybe the world had failed him. Either way, the result was the same. My son had become someone who would look me in the eye and dismiss his father's life work as sentimentality. I want to see the books, I said. All of them. Every transaction, every account, every contract signed since your father died. Victor laughed, actually laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. Mrs. Blake, I'm afraid that's not going to happen. I'm afraid it is, I replied. I'm still a shareholder in this company. I still have rights. Actually, Nathan said, pulling a folder from his briefcase, you don't. He slid the papers across the table, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. Legal documents, official looking and intimidating, but the gist was clear enough. My shares in Sinclair Motors were being transferred to a trust controlled by Nathan, effective immediately. You can't do this, I whispered. I already have, Nathan said. The lawyers assured me it's perfectly legal. You're getting older, Mother. Father's death hit you hard. Everyone understands that you're not capable of making business decisions right now. I'm 65, not 95. You're a grieving widow who's been making wild accusations based on gossip and speculation, Victor said smoothly. The board agrees that your emotional state makes you unsuitable for business involvement. The board. My friends, people I'd known for decades, people who'd eaten at my table and celebrated holidays with my family, they'd agreed to this. They'd signed off on stripping me of everything Robert had worked to build, everything he'd wanted me to have. How long have you been planning this? I asked. Nathan had the grace to look uncomfortable, but Victor smiled like a shark scenting blood. Business is about timing, Mrs. Blake. Your husband's death created certain opportunities. Smart people recognize opportunities. I looked at the papers again, at the legal jargon that was stealing my life away, and something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped, like a rubber band stretched too far, rebounding with deadly force. Get out, I said quietly. Excuse me. Nathan blinked. Get out, I screamed, my voice echoing off the walls Robert had painted himself in the house he'd filled with love and laughter and dreams. Get out of my house. Victor actually took a step back, but Nathan's face hardened. Actually, Mother, it's not your house anymore either. The words hit me like a physical blow. I grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. The house was in Father's name, Nathan continued, his voice clinical, detached. As his heir, it passes to me. You have 30 days to find other accommodations. 30 days. 30 days to pack up 38 years of marriage. 30 days to say goodbye to the life Robert and I had built together. 30 days to figure out how to survive on whatever scraps they decided to leave me. Nathan, I whispered my son's name, breaking like glass in my mouth. How can you do this to me? For just a moment, his mask slipped. I saw the boy who used to curl up in my lap during thunderstorms, who'd cried when he broke his arm falling out of the apple tree, who'd hugged me so tight when Robert died that I thought he might never let go. You did this to yourself, he said, but his voice cracked slightly. All you had to do was trust me. All you had to do was keep quiet and let me run the company. But you couldn't do that, could you? You had to ask questions. You had to cause problems. I asked questions because I love you, I said desperately. Because I didn't want you to make mistakes that would destroy everything your father worked for. What father worked for is mine now, Nathan said, his voice hardening again, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it. Even from me, especially from you. The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut. This wasn't my son anymore. This was a stranger wearing my son's face, speaking my son's voice, destroying my son's family. I need some air, I said quietly, moving toward the door. Mother, Nathan called after me, and for a second I thought he might apologize, might come to his senses, might remember who he used to be. Take your purse, we're going for a drive. Something in his tone made my blood freeze. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. I don't want to go anywhere, I said. It wasn't a request, Victor said, and suddenly he was behind me, his hand on my arm, not rough, not violent, but firm enough to make his meaning clear. Let go of me. My voice was steady, but my heart was pounding. Get your purse, Mrs. Blake, Victor repeated, his grip tightening just enough to remind me how much stronger he was. We're all going to take a nice drive together. I looked at Nathan, waiting for him to intervene, to protect me, to remember that he was my son before he was anything else. Instead, he picked up his car keys. Come on, Mother, he said. Time for that lesson I mentioned. The drive through the October night felt like descending into hell. I sat in the passenger seat of Nathan's Mercedes, the same Mercedes Robert had bought him for his 40th birthday, while Victor followed in his own car. The rain had started as a drizzle, but was now coming down in sheets, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm. Nathan drove in silence, his jaw set, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it might escape. I tried to make conversation, tried to reach the son I knew was still somewhere inside this cold stranger, but every attempt was met with silence. We passed the Sinclair Motors headquarters, the building Robert had designed himself, with its distinctive copper dome and wide windows. Even at night, it looked proud and strong, a monument to one man's determination to build something lasting. In a few hours, employees would start arriving for the morning shift, people whose livelihoods depended on the company Robert had built with his own hands. What would happen to them if Nathan was really involved in something illegal? What would happen to their families, their futures, their faith in the American dream that Robert had embodied? We turned onto Highway 47, heading away from town, away from streetlights and houses, into the kind of darkness that swallows screams. I'd driven this road 1,000 times. It led to Miller's Lake, where Robert and I used to take Nathan for picnics when he was small, where we'd taught him to fish, to skip stones, to appreciate the simple beauty of nature. The irony wasn't lost on me that Nathan was taking me back to one of our happiest places to deliver what felt increasingly like my worst nightmare. After 20 minutes, Nathan pulled over at a scenic overlook, the same spot where Robert had proposed to me 40 years ago, where we'd brought Nathan to watch meteor showers and count fireflies. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the car roof like angry fists. Get out, Nathan said quietly. What? I turned to stare at him, water from the rain-soaked windows casting strange shadows across his face. Get out of the car, Mother. Nathan, it's pouring rain. What are you doing? He turned to look at me, and in the dim light from the dashboard, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't anger or frustration. This was cold, calculated determination. This was the face of someone who had made a decision and wouldn't be swayed by appeals to emotion or family bonds. You wanted to know what I learned from Father, Nathan said. I learned that sentiment is weakness. I learned that family loyalty is a luxury successful people can't afford, and I learned that sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect what matters. I'm your mother, I whispered. You're a threat, he replied, and threats have to be eliminated. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing quarterly earnings or inventory levels, made my blood turn to ice water. Nathan, please, get out, he roared suddenly, his composure cracking. Get out now! I fumbled for the door handle with shaking hands. The rain hit me like a wall of needles, soaking through my clothes in seconds. I heard Victor's car door slam behind me, his footsteps splashing through puddles as he approached. Nathan rolled down his window just far enough to speak. "Maybe a few hours out here will teach you what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you," he said. "Maybe you'll learn to appreciate what you had instead of trying to destroy it." "Nathan, you can't leave me here." I grabbed the door handle, but he'd already locked it. "I could die out here." "You should have thought about that before you decided to cause problems." Victor appeared beside the car, his expensive suit already soaked, his hair plastered to his skull. He leaned down to Nathan's window and said something I couldn't hear over the sound of the rain. Nathan nodded and rolled the window back up. "Please." I pounded on the glass with both fists, my voice breaking. "Nathan, I'm your mother. I love you." For just a second, I saw him flinch. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he looked like he might change his mind, might remember who he used to be, might remember the woman who had rocked him to sleep and kissed his scraped knees and cheered at every Little League game. Then Victor said something else, and the moment passed. Nathan put the car in drive and pulled away, his taillights disappearing into the rain like dying embers. I stood there in the downpour, 65 years old and abandoned on a country highway 50 miles from home, watching my son drive away from me like I was nothing more than roadkill to be forgotten. The rain soaked through my wool coat, through my silk blouse, through my skin, and into my bones. My purse offered no protection from the elements, and my sensible heels were useless on the muddy shoulder of the road. I was cold, wet, scared, and more alone than I'd ever been in my life. But I was also something else, something that surprised me with its intensity. I was furious. Not just angry, furious, the kind of fury that burns through fear and desperation and transforms victims into warriors. The kind of fury that my grandmother had carried during the Depression when she'd fought to keep her family fed and housed. The kind of fury that had driven Robert to work 18-hour days to build something from nothing. The kind of fury that could move mountains or topple empires. Standing there in the storm, abandoned by my own flesh and blood, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to curl up and die. I wasn't going to accept this betrayal quietly. I wasn't going to let my son and his criminal associate destroy everything Robert had built. I was going to fight back. I was going to take back what was mine. I was going to teach Nathan Blake what happened when you underestimated Miranda Blake. The rain continued to fall, but I was no longer just standing there getting soaked. I was planning, strategizing, remembering everything Robert had taught me about business and everything life had taught me about survival. My son thought he was giving me a lesson in helplessness. Instead, he'd just awakened something that had been sleeping since Robert's funeral, the part of me that had helped build Sinclair Motors, the part that had stood beside my husband through every challenge, the part that had raised a family and managed a household and navigated 40 years of marriage and motherhood. The part of me that was Robert Blake's partner in every sense of the word. Nathan had no idea what he'd just unleashed, but he was about to find out. The storm was just beginning. I'd been standing in that downpour for what felt like hours when the headlights cut through the darkness like salvation itself. My teeth were chattering so violently I could barely think straight. My designer coat had become a sodden weight, dragging me toward the muddy ground, and my carefully styled hair hung in wet ropes around my face. I'd gone from respected widow to drowned rat in the span of one terrible evening. The pickup truck slowed, then pulled over about 20 feet ahead of me. For a moment, I hesitated. Every news story about women disappearing on lonely highways flashed through my mind. But then I realized something that should have been terrifying, but was actually liberating. What did I have left to lose? My son had already taken everything that mattered. The driver's door opened, and a figure emerged into the rain, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of deliberate precision that spoke of military training. As he approached, the headlights illuminated his face, and I felt my knees nearly buckle with relief and disbelief. Miranda. Jesus Christ, what are you doing out here? James Carter. Staff Sergeant James Carter, retired Robert's oldest friend and former Army buddy. the man who'd stood beside my husband at our wedding, who'd been Nathan's godfather, who'd helped carry Robert's coffin just 8 months ago. His weathered face was creased with concern and something else, something that looked almost like he'd been expecting to find me here. James, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain. Nathan, they left me. He was beside me in an instant, shrugging out of his worn leather jacket and wrapping it around my shoulders. The jacket smelled like motor oil and Old Spice, familiar and comforting, in a way that made tears mix with the rainwater on my cheeks. "Come on," he said gently, his hand steady on my elbow as he guided me toward his truck. "Let's get you warm and dry. We'll talk inside." The interior of James's pickup was worn but clean, with the kind of lived-in comfort that spoke of a man who took care of his possessions. He cranked up the heat and handed me a thermos of coffee that tasted like heaven and burned like liquid courage going down my throat. "Now," he said, his gray eyes serious in the dashboard light, "tell me what happened." So I did. Everything. The dinner, the accusations, the legal documents, Nathan's cold dismissal of his father's memory, Victor's subtle threats, and finally the ride to nowhere that had ended with me abandoned on the highway like unwanted cargo. James listened without interruption, his jaw tightening with each detail, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out into the rain-soaked darkness. "Son of a bitch," he said finally, and the quiet fury in his voice made me look at him more carefully. "I told Robert this might happen. I told him Nathan was getting in too deep." "What do you mean?" My heart started pounding again. "James, did Robert know something was wrong?" James turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw something that changed everything: guilt, regret, and the weight of secrets kept too long. "Miranda, there's something you need to know, something Robert made me promise to keep quiet unless," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "unless something like this happened, unless Nathan crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed." The coffee turned to acid in my stomach. "What kind of secret?" James reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a sealed envelope yellowed with age and bearing my name in Robert's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I took it, recognizing the careful script of a man who'd written me love letters for 38 years. "He gave me this 6 months before he died," James said quietly. "Made me promise to give it to you if he ever hurt you. Robert loved that boy more than life itself, but he wasn't blind to his faults." I stared at the envelope, afraid to open it, afraid of what final message my husband might have left me. How did he know? Robert was a lot of things, but stupid wasn't one of them. He'd been watching Nathan for months, noticing things: money disappearing, meetings with people who didn't belong in legitimate business, phone calls that ended when Robert walked into the room. James's voice grew harder. "And then there was Victor Kozlov." "What about Victor?" "Robert ran a background check on him when Nathan wanted to bring him on as CFO, found some interesting discrepancies in his resume, some connections to people who make their living in very gray areas of international finance." James met my eyes. "Robert tried to talk to Nathan about it, but the boy was convinced Victor was going to help him take Sinclair Motors to the next level." "And now?" "Now I think Victor's taking Sinclair Motors somewhere all right, just not where Nathan thinks." With shaking fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in Robert's handwriting, along with what looked like legal documents and a small silver key I didn't recognize. The letter was dated 3 months before Robert's heart attack. "My dearest Miranda, if James is giving you this letter, it means my worst fears about Nathan have come true. I pray I'm wrong, that I'm just an old man seeing shadows where there's only sunlight, but I've learned to trust my instincts in business, and right now they're screaming warnings. I've been watching our son's sweetheart, and what I see breaks my heart. Somewhere along the way, the boy who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on ants has become someone who sees people as obstacles to be removed. I don't know if it's the pressure of living up to my legacy or something darker, but Nathan is heading down a path that will destroy everything we've built. Viktor Kozlov is not who he claims to be. The documents in this envelope will show you what I've discovered about his real background, his connections to some very dangerous people, and what I believe is his ultimate plan for Sinclair Motors. I've been building a case, gathering evidence, preparing for the day when I might have to choose between my company and my son. I pray that day never comes, but if it does, if Nathan forces your hand, you have weapons he doesn't know about. The key in this envelope opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank box number 847. Inside, you'll find everything you need to take back what's ours. Miranda, my darling girl, you are stronger than you know. You helped me build this company from nothing, and you can rebuild it again if you have to. Don't let our son destroy the dreams we worked so hard to make real. Don't let him dishonor the memory of the man I tried to be. Fight for what's right. Fight for our people. Fight for the future we dreamed of. All my love, always and forever, Robert P.S. James knows more than he's let on. Trust him. He's the only one who can help you navigate what's coming. I read the letter twice, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. Robert had known. He'd seen what I'd been too blind to notice, what I'd been too hopeful to accept. Our son was lost to us, but my husband had left me a roadmap back to the light. James, I said quietly, looking up to find him watching me with concern. What else did Robert tell you? He was quiet for a moment, then started the truck. Let's get you somewhere warm and dry first. Then I'll show you what your husband was really working on in those final months. We drove through the rain-soaked night in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept reading Robert's letter, memorizing every word, feeling his presence in the careful script and familiar phrases. Even in death, he was still trying to protect me, still trying to take care of his family. James pulled into the driveway of a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place a retired military man might choose for its strategic location and defensible positions. As we dashed through the rain to the front door, I caught a glimpse of a well-maintained garden and security cameras discreetly positioned around the property. Inside the house was exactly what I'd expected from James Carter, clean, organized, functional. Military precision in every corner, from the perfectly aligned magazines on the coffee table to the collection of service medals displayed with humble pride on the mantel. Sit, he said, pointing to a comfortable leather chair near the fireplace. I'll make some real coffee and get you a blanket. While he busied himself in the kitchen, I looked around the room and noticed things I'd missed on previous visits. A sophisticated computer set up in the corner, filing cabinets that looked more secure than the ones at Sinclair Motors, maps on the wall with various locations marked in different colored pins. This wasn't just the home of a retired soldier, it was a command center bar. James returned with coffee and a warm blanket, settling into the chair across from me with the ease of a man accustomed to difficult conversations. How long have you been watching Nathan? I asked. Since about 6 months after Robert's funeral, he admitted. Your husband asked me to keep an eye on things, make sure Nathan didn't get in over his head. At first I thought it was just grief and inexperience. Young CEO trying to prove himself, making some questionable decisions, but nothing catastrophic. And then Viktor Kozlov started making trips to some very interesting places. Chicago, yes, but also Miami, Las Vegas, and most concerning of all, a little town in New Jersey that's known primarily for its connections to certain family operations. My blood chilled. You mean the mafia? I mean people who make their living moving money that needs to disappear, who provide services that can't be found in the yellow pages. James leaned forward, his expression grave. Miranda, I think Nathan believes he's running some kind of sophisticated international business operation. What he's really doing is being set up as the fall guy for a money laundering operation that could destroy not just him, but everyone connected to Sinclair Motors. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. How much danger is he in? How much danger are all of you in, you mean? James stood and walked to one of the filing cabinets, returning with a thick folder. These are copies of documents I've managed to gather over the past few months: financial records, travel itineraries, meeting notes, photographs. He spread the contents across the coffee table, and I found myself staring at a conspiracy larger and more dangerous than anything I'd imagined. Photos of Nathan shaking hands with men whose faces belonged in police lineups, financial records showing money flowing through Sinclair Motors accounts in patterns that made no business sense, travel records documenting Victor's trips to known money laundering hubs. "Oh my God," I whispered, picking up a photograph of Nathan and Victor meeting with a man whose cold eyes and expensive suit screamed professional criminal. "Nathan has no idea what he's gotten himself into, does he?" "I don't think so," James agreed. "I think Victor convinced him he was helping him expand into international markets, maybe bend a few rules to increase profits. Nathan's always been ambitious, always wanted to prove he could surpass his father's achievements. Victor fed that ambition until Nathan was in too deep to back out." "But why Sinclair Motors? Why us?" James pulled out another document, this one showing the company's financial profile. "Because Robert built exactly the kind of operation criminals dream about: a legitimate, profitable business with multiple revenue streams, complex supply chains, and an international customer base, perfect for moving dirty money while maintaining plausible deniability." I studied the papers, my mind racing. Robert had always taught me to look for patterns, to follow the money trail, to ask the questions that made people uncomfortable. The evidence was overwhelming. Sinclair Motors was being systematically transformed from my husband's dream into a criminal enterprise. "What's their end game?" I asked. "Best case scenario for them?" "They use Sinclair Motors to launder millions of dollars over the next few years, then disappear when the heat gets too intense, leaving Nathan holding the bag. Worst case scenario." James's expression darkened. "They decide Nathan knows too much, or that he's becoming too much of a liability. They'd kill him." "Miranda, these aren't people who file lawsuits when business partnerships go bad. They solve problems permanently." The weight of the situation crashed over me like a physical force. My son, my stubborn, arrogant, foolish son, was walking blindfolded toward a cliff, and in his arrogance, he'd pushed away the one person who might have been able to help him see the danger. "What about the employees?" I asked. "What happens to them when this all comes crashing down? 2,000 people lose their jobs, their pensions disappear, their health insurance vanishes. The company Robert spent his life building becomes a footnote in a federal money laundering case." James's voice was heavy with the weight of inevitable tragedy. "And Nathan goes to prison for the rest of his life, if he's lucky enough to live that long." I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around us. My son had betrayed me, stolen my inheritance, and thrown me away like garbage. But he was still my son, still the little boy who'd once trusted me to keep him safe from monsters under the bed. Now the monsters were real, and he'd invited them into his life with open arms. "James," I said finally, "show me what Robert left in that safety deposit box." We drove to the bank first thing the next morning after I'd spent a sleepless night reading through Robert's files and formulating a plan. James had insisted I stay in his guest room, and I'd been grateful for both the safety and the solitude. I needed time to transform from abandoned wife back into Miranda Blake, the woman who'd helped build an empire. The safety deposit box contained treasures beyond my imagination: copies of Sinclair Motors' original incorporation documents showing share distributions I'd forgotten about, detailed financial records documenting every questionable transaction Victor had orchestrated, photographs and surveillance reports James had helped Robert compile, and most importantly, a thick folder labeled contingency plans. "Your husband was a strategist," James said as we spread the documents across the bank's private viewing room table. "He didn't just identify problems, he developed solutions." The contingency plans were brilliant in their simplicity and devastating in their potential impact. Robert had quietly documented every aspect of Victor's operation while simultaneously building legal cases for multiple scenarios. He'd prepared for the possibility that Nathan might be an unwilling victim, a willing collaborator, or something in between. But the crown jewel was a document I'd completely forgotten about, a trust agreement Robert and I had signed 15 years earlier during a period when Sinclair Motors had been considering going public. The trust gave me controlling interest in the company under specific circumstances, including incapacity or malfeasance on the part of the designated heir. Nathan never knew about this. I breathed, staring at the legal language that could change everything. Robert made sure of that, James confirmed. He hoped it would never be necessary, but he wanted to make sure you had options if Nathan ever threatened the company's integrity. This could invalidate everything Nathan did yesterday. More than that, combined with the evidence of financial misconduct, it could give you grounds to remove Nathan as CEO and take direct control of Sinclair Motors. I leaned back in my chair, my mind spinning with possibilities. 24 hours ago, I'd been a powerless widow discarded by her own son. Now I was looking at weapons that could topple kingdoms. There's something else, James said, pulling out a final document. Robert was working with someone inside the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, someone who's been building a case against Victor's associates for the past 2 years. The FBI knows about this. They know about the larger operation Victor's connected to. They've been waiting for the right moment to move, gathering evidence, building an airtight case. James met my eyes. What they didn't know about was Sinclair Motors' involvement. Robert was going to be their inside source, their way into Victor's specific operation. And now they need a new inside source. Someone Victor trusts, someone with access to the company's records, someone motivated to see justice done. I understood what he was suggesting, and the audacity of it took my breath away. You want me to go undercover, in my own company. I want you to take back what's yours while helping the FBI take down the people who are destroying your husband's legacy. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was complex, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. I would return home as the defeated, broken widow Nathan expected me to be. I would apologize for causing trouble, beg for his forgiveness, and gradually work my way back into his good graces. Meanwhile, I would be gathering evidence, documenting crimes, and building the case that would ultimately save my son from his own stupidity. It meant playing the role of a lifetime. It meant convincing my own son that I was weak and harmless when I was actually preparing for war. It meant betraying Nathan's trust, even as I worked to save his life. Can you do it? James asked. Can you look your son in the eye and pretend to be someone you're not? I thought about Robert, about the employees counting on Sinclair Motors for their livelihoods, about the legacy that was being perverted into something criminal. I thought about the boy Nathan had been and the man he might still become if someone saved him from the consequences of his own arrogance. Robert always said I was the best negotiator he'd ever met, I said. Time to find out if he was right. James drove me home that afternoon, but not before we'd made several stops. First, to meet with Robert's lawyer who'd helped create the trust documents and who assured me they were legally ironclad. Second, to visit Margaret Chen, who'd been quietly documenting financial irregularities and who agreed to serve as our inside source at the company. Third, to a small office building where I was introduced to Special Agent Sarah Morrison of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Agent Morrison was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that radiated from her eyes like heat from a forge. She'd been working Robert's case for months, waiting for the right moment to move. Mrs. Blake, she said as we shook hands, I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband was going to be instrumental in taking down a money laundering operation that spans 3 countries and involves tens of millions of dollars. And now we need to decide whether to move forward with what we have or wait and see if we can develop a better case. She leaned forward, her expression serious. I'll be honest with you, what we have on Viktor Kozlov and his associates is strong but not airtight. What we have on your son is circumstantial. He could walk away with probation, or he could go to prison for 20 years depending on how deep his involvement really goes. What do you need from me? Access, financial records, meeting schedules, recorded conversations if possible, evidence that could help us determine whether Nathan is a victim or a co-conspirator. And in return, we do everything in our power to minimize his legal exposure while taking down the people who are really running this operation. The deal was struck with handshakes and promises, but I knew the real work was just beginning. I had to become someone I'd never been before, spy, in my own life, a detective investigating my own family, a warrior fighting a war my son didn't even know was being fought. As James drove me back to Sinclair Manor, my home for 30 years, the house Nathan was forcing me to leave, I practiced the performance of a lifetime. The broken widow, the chastened mother, the helpless woman who'd learned her lesson and was ready to accept her place in the new order. But underneath the performance, Miranda Blake was preparing for battle, and this was one war I had no intention of losing. The house looked exactly the same as I'd left it 24 hours earlier, but everything felt different. The familiar rooms seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I walked through the front door with James beside me, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Nathan was waiting in the living room, pacing like a caged animal. When he saw me, his expression flickered between guilt and defiance, settling somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between the two. "Mother," he said stiffly, "you're back." "Yes," I replied quietly, channeling every acting lesson I'd ever watched, every performance I'd ever seen. "I'm back, and I owe you an apology." The surprise on his face was almost worth the humiliation of saying the words. "An apology." Nathan's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment I saw the uncertain boy beneath the cold businessman's facade. "Mother, what happened last night shouldn't have—" "No," I interrupted, letting my voice tremble just enough to sell the performance. "You were right, Nathan. I was interfering, asking questions I had no business asking. I've been so lost since your father died, so desperate to feel useful again, that I forgot my place." James squeezed my shoulder gently, a gesture that looked supportive, but was actually a reminder to stay in character. The broken widow, remember, the chastened mother who'd learned her lesson. Nathan looked genuinely uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he had as a child when he'd been caught in a lie. "Mother leaving you on the highway like that, it was wrong. I was angry and you were protecting your company," I said softly. "Your father would have understood that even if I didn't at the time." The words tasted like poison, but I forced them out with what I hoped looked like sincere contrition. "I spent all night thinking about what you said, about how times have changed, about how I need to trust your judgment." The relief on Nathan's face was so genuine it made my heart ache. This was still my son, still the boy who wanted his mother's approval even as he pushed her away. Whatever Victor had done to manipulate him, whatever darkness he'd fallen into, there was still something redeemable buried beneath the corporate coldness. "I'm glad you understand," Nathan said, his voice warming slightly. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mother. I just need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." "I do trust you." I lied, hating myself for the deception, even as I recognized its necessity. "I trust you completely. In fact, I was hoping you might let me help somehow. Nothing important, nothing that would interfere with your vision for the company. Maybe just small things, volunteer work, or community outreach. I need something to do, Nathan. Without your father, without the company, I feel so useless." It was a masterful stroke, if I did say so myself. Every word was calculated to appeal to Nathan's guilt while positioning me as harmless and pathetic. The grieving widow, looking for purpose, not the strategic mind planning his downfall. Nathan's expression softened further. "Of course, Mother. I'm sure we can find something appropriate for you to do. Maybe you could help with the employee appreciation events or the charity drives. That would be wonderful, I breathed, letting genuine emotion creep into my voice, though not for the reasons Nathan thought. I just want to feel close to your father's legacy again to honor the work he did. Then it settled. Nathan actually smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. We'll find you a nice little project to work on. Something that will make you feel involved without interfering with the real business, I finished. I understand completely. James cleared his throat diplomatically. Miranda, I should probably get going. Let you two have some time to talk. Of course, Nathan said, suddenly remembering his manners. James, thank you for looking after her last night. I know my father would have appreciated it. Robert asked me to keep an eye on his family, but James replied, the words carrying more weight than Nathan could possibly understand. It's a promise I intend to keep. After James left, Nathan and I spent the next hour in what felt like a delicate dance of reconciliation. He apologized more fully for abandoning me on the highway, though he was careful to frame it as a regrettable overreaction rather than a calculated cruelty. I accepted his apology with grace while carefully probing for information about his plans for the company. Victor seems to have some interesting ideas about international expansion, I said casually as we sat in the kitchen sharing coffee and store-bought cookies, a far cry from the homemade treats I used to bake for our family talks. Nathan's face lit up with enthusiasm. Mother, you should see the projections he's put together. We could triple our revenue within 2 years, maybe quadruple it. All it takes is thinking bigger, being willing to work with partners who understand global markets. What kind of partners? I asked, keeping my tone innocently curious. Import-export specialists, international financing experts, people who know how to navigate the complexities of modern business. Nathan's voice carried the fervor of a true believer, and I realized with growing horror that he genuinely thought he was building something legitimate. Victor has connections all over the world, Chicago, Miami, even some European contacts. He's opening doors for us that Father never could have imagined. I nodded encouragingly while my mind raced. Nathan really didn't understand what he'd gotten himself into. Victor had convinced him that criminal enterprises were simply modern business practices, that money laundering was international financing, that mob connections were import-export specialists. It sounds very sophisticated, I said carefully. Your father always believed in building relationships with the right people. Exactly. Nathan leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. Father was brilliant for his time, but he was limited by his conventional thinking. He never understood that business today requires a certain flexibility, a willingness to work in gray areas that previous generations might have found uncomfortable. Gray areas. That's how Victor had sold it to him, not as criminal activity, but as sophisticated business practices that squeamish people might not understand. My son wasn't evil. He was naive and desperate to prove himself worthy of Robert's legacy, which made him the perfect mark for someone like Victor Kozlov. Well, I said, standing and smoothing down my skirt, I should let you get back to work. I know you have important things to do. Actually, Nathan said, his expression becoming slightly hesitant, there's something else we need to discuss. About the house. My heart clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. Oh, what I said yesterday about you needing to find other accommodations. I was angry and I spoke too hastily. Nathan had the grace to look embarrassed. This is your home, Mother. It always will be. I would never actually force you to leave. The relief that washed over me was genuine, though not for the reasons Nathan thought. I needed access to this house, to the study where Robert had conducted so much of his business, to the files and documents that might still be hidden here. Thank you, I said softly. That means more to me than you know. Good. Then it's settled. You'll stay here, we'll find you some volunteer work with the company, and everything will go back to normal. Normal. If only he knew how far from normal things were about to become. That evening, after Nathan left for what he described as a business dinner with Victor, I began my real work. The house felt different now that I knew I was searching for evidence of crimes rather than simply reminiscing about happier times. Every room held potential secrets. Every drawer might contain the key to understanding the full scope of Victor's operation. I started with Robert's study, a wood-paneled sanctuary where my husband had spent countless hours reviewing contracts, analyzing market reports, and planning Sinclair Motors' future. The room still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and the leather-bound books he'd collected over the years. Using the techniques James had taught me during our crash course in surveillance, I methodically searched every inch of the study. Behind Robert's desk, hidden beneath a loose floorboard I might never have noticed if I hadn't been looking for it, I found a manila envelope containing photographs and documents that made my blood run cold. The photographs showed Victor meeting with men whose faces belonged on FBI wanted posters, not just once or twice, but repeatedly over a period of months. The documents were financial records detailing transactions that could only be described as money laundering, dirty money flowing into Sinclair Motors through fake consulting contracts, phantom suppliers, and bogus international partnerships. But the most damning evidence was a handwritten note in Robert's careful script: V. Kozlov, real name Viktor Kozlovsky, born Minsk, Belarus, suspected organized crime connections dating back 15 years. Current operation appears focused on establishing Sinclair Motors as primary money laundering vehicle for East Coast crime syndicate. Estimated illegal funds processed to date $15 to $20 million. $20 million. $20 million in criminal money had flowed through my late husband's company, and Nathan had no idea he was orchestrating one of the largest money laundering operations in the region. I photographed everything with the small camera James had given me, my hands shaking as I documented the evidence that could destroy my son's life or save it, depending on how skillfully we played the game ahead of us. The next few weeks fell into a carefully orchestrated routine. During the day, I played the role of the grateful, harmless widow who was slowly finding her place in Nathan's new order. I attended charity committee meetings, organized employee appreciation luncheons, and made small talk with company executives who treated me with the kind of patronizing kindness reserved for elderly relatives who might become difficult if not properly managed. But beneath the performance, I was gathering intelligence with the focused intensity of a professional spy. Margaret Chen became my primary source for financial information, quietly copying documents and flagging suspicious transactions for my review. James maintained his surveillance of Victor's activities, tracking the CFO's movements and photographing his meetings with increasingly dangerous-looking associates. And I began to understand the true scope of the criminal enterprise that had infected Sinclair Motors like a cancer. Victor's operation was breathtakingly sophisticated. He'd identified legitimate business expenses that could be inflated to absorb dirty money, consulting fees, equipment purchases, overseas partnerships, and had created a network of shell companies to facilitate the laundering process. On paper, Sinclair Motors was simply expanding its international presence and investing in cutting-edge business development. In reality, it was washing millions of dollars for some of the most dangerous criminals on the East Coast. The beauty of the scheme from Victor's perspective was its plausible deniability. If the operation was ever exposed, Nathan would appear to be the mastermind, the ambitious young CEO who'd gotten greedy and stupid. Victor would disappear into the shadows, leaving my son to face federal prosecutors alone. 3 weeks into my undercover operation, I got my first real break. Nathan mentioned that he and Victor would be attending a business dinner at the Cardinal Club, one of the city's most exclusive private establishments, the kind of place where powerful men made deals that never appeared in official records. Just a routine networking event, Nathan explained as he adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. Victor says it's important to maintain relationships with our consulting partners. Consulting partners. Even now, after everything I'd learned, Nathan still believed he was engaged in legitimate business activities. "Have a wonderful evening, dear," I said, kissing his cheek with what I hoped looked like maternal affection. "Don't stay out too late." As soon as Nathan's car disappeared down the driveway, I was on the phone with James. "He's going to the Cardinal Club with Victor," I said without preamble. "This could be our chance to see who they're really working with." "The Cardinal Club has more security than Fort Knox," James replied. "There's no way we can get surveillance equipment inside." "We don't need surveillance equipment," I said, an idea forming with crystalline clarity. "We need a member." "Miranda, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Margaret Chen's husband has been a member of the Cardinal Club for 20 years. I'm thinking that a grieving widow who wants to honor her late husband's memory might convince an old family friend to help her with a very special project." Dr. Harold Chen was a distinguished cardiologist who treated half the wealthy families in the city, including the Blakes. When I called and asked if I could meet with him about a delicate family matter, he agreed immediately. We met at his office that evening after his last patient had gone home. Harold was a small, precise man in his 60s with the kind of careful bedside manner that had made him successful in his profession. He listened with growing concern as I explained my situation, though I was careful to frame it as a mother's worry about her son's business associates rather than a federal investigation into criminal activity. "You want me to help you spy on Nathan?" Harold asked when I finished. "I want you to help me protect him," I corrected. "Harold, you knew Robert. You know he would never have approved of the kind of people Nathan seems to be associating with. I'm afraid my son is getting involved with individuals who might not have his best interests at heart." Harold was quiet for several minutes, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and reached for his phone. "The Cardinal Club has a strict no cameras policy," he said as he dialed, "but they do allow members to bring guests to certain events. And there's a private dining room that overlooks the main restaurant area." "Harold, I can't ask you to. Margaret told me about the financial irregularities she's been documenting," he interrupted, "about the questions you've been asking. Robert Blake was a good man, Miranda. If his son is heading down a dangerous path, someone needs to intervene." An hour later, I was sitting in Harold Chen's car outside the Cardinal Club, wearing Margaret's black cocktail dress and feeling like an amateur actor who'd somehow wandered onto a professional stage. The plan was simple. Harold would take me to dinner at the club's restaurant, positioning us where we could observe Nathan's meeting without being noticed. I would try to identify Victor's associates and document as much of the conversation as possible. The Cardinal Club was exactly what I'd expected: old money, elegance, leather, and mahogany portraits of dead industrialists staring down from the walls with expressions of perpetual disapproval. Harold guided me to a corner table with a clear view of the private dining area where Nathan and Victor were seated with three other men. Even from across the restaurant, I could tell these weren't the kind of people who belonged in legitimate business circles. They had the predatory stillness of professional criminals, the expensive suits and careful grooming that marked them as successful in ventures that operated outside the law. "Do you recognize any of them?" Harold whispered. I studied the faces through the small opera glasses Harold had thoughtfully provided, committing every detail to memory. The eldest of the three appeared to be in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of casual authority that suggested he was accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. The other two were younger, perhaps in their 40s, with the hard edges and watchful eyes of men who'd survived in dangerous professions. "No," I said quietly, "but James might. He's been researching Victor's associates for months." We watched in fascination as Victor conducted what was clearly a business meeting, spreading documents across the table and pointing to various charts and graphs. Nathan nodded along enthusiastically, occasionally asking questions that made the older man smile in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Then something happened that made my blood freeze. The eldest man pulled out a photograph and showed it to Nathan, who studied it with interest before passing it to Victor. Even from our distant vantage point, I could see that Nathan's expression had changed. He looked confused, perhaps even concerned. Victor said something that seemed to reassure him, but I caught the glance that passed between Victor and the older man. It was the look of predators who'd successfully isolated their prey. "Harold," I whispered urgently, "I need to get closer. I need to hear what they're saying." "Miranda, that's too dangerous. If they see you, they won't see me," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The ladies' room is just around the corner from their table. If I time it right." Against Harold's better judgment, I excused myself and made my way toward the restroom, taking a circuitous route that brought me within earshot of Nathan's table. The acoustics of the restaurant worked in my favor, allowing me to catch fragments of conversation as I passed. "Shipment arrives Thursday, Dock 17, usual procedures. Concerned about federal attention, recent investigations. Your son seems nervous, Victor. Perhaps he's not ready for this level of operation." "Nathan's fine." Victor's voice smooth and reassuring. "He trusts me completely. He has no idea what we're really moving. And if he becomes a problem, he won't. But if he does—" I didn't hear Victor's response, but the casual tone in which he'd discussed Nathan's potential elimination made my knees weak. My son wasn't just involved in money laundering, he was being set up as the expendable frontman for something much larger and more dangerous. I made it to the ladies' room on unsteady legs, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd overheard. Thursday, Dock 17, a shipment that had nothing to do with legitimate business and everything to do with whatever criminal enterprise Victor was really running. When I returned to Harold's table, I was pale and shaking. "What did you hear?" he asked quietly. "Enough to know that Nathan is in more danger than I ever imagined," I replied. "And not just legal danger, physical danger." The ride home was conducted in tense silence, both of us processing what we'd witnessed. Harold dropped me off at the manor with promises to say nothing about our evening's activities, and I went straight to my bedroom phone to call James. "We have a problem," I said as soon as he answered. "A bigger problem than we thought." I recounted everything I'd observed and overheard at the Cardinal Club, watching James's expression grow darker with each detail. "Thursday at Dock 17, he repeated. "Miranda, I think Victor's operation is about to expand beyond money laundering. I think they're planning to use Sinclair Motors' trucking subsidiary to move physical contraband." "What kind of contraband?" "The kind that carries mandatory minimum sentences, the kind that could put Nathan away for life, even if he's completely innocent." We spent the next hour planning our response. James would contact Agent Morrison and brief her on the Thursday shipment, giving the FBI an opportunity to intercept whatever Victor was planning to move through Sinclair Motors' transportation network. I would continue my surveillance, gathering as much evidence as possible while trying to keep Nathan safe from the consequences of his own naivety. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the old house settle around me, I couldn't shake the memory of Victor's casual tone when he'd discussed Nathan's potential elimination. My son wasn't just a pawn in Victor's game. He was a liability that could be disposed of if he became inconvenient. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Nathan called from the office, his voice tight with excitement and something that might have been fear. "Mother," he said, "Victor has an amazing opportunity for us, a chance to prove that Sinclair Motors is ready to compete on a global scale." "What kind of opportunity?" "I can't discuss it over the phone, but it involves a special shipping contract that could net us more profit in a single month than we usually make in a quarter." Nathan's voice carried the breathless enthusiasm of a gambler who thought he'd discovered a sure thing. "Victor says it's the kind of deal that separates successful companies from mediocre ones." "When?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Tomorrow night. Thursday. We're handling a very special cargo shipment, something that requires absolute discretion and precision timing." "Nathan," I said carefully, "are you sure about this? It sounds risky." "Of course it's risky, Mother. All the best opportunities are risky, but Victor has walked me through every aspect of the operation. Nothing can go wrong. Everything was about to go wrong, and Nathan had no idea he was walking into a trap that could destroy his life and potentially end it. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the time for subtle investigation and careful planning had passed. Tomorrow night, the war for Sinclair Motors would begin in earnest, and I still wasn't sure which side my son would be on when the shooting started. Thursday morning dawned gray and ominous, as if the sky itself knew what was coming. I stood at my bedroom window watching the first light struggle through heavy clouds and felt the weight of everything that would happen in the next 24 hours, pressing down on me like a physical force. Today would either save my son or destroy him, and I was the only one who could tip the balance. James arrived at 7 sharp bringing coffee and the kind of grim determination that came with years of military training. We sat in Robert's study, surrounded by evidence of Victor's crimes, and finalized our plan with the precision of generals preparing for battle. Agent Morrison has teams positioned around Dock 70. James reported, his voice low and urgent. They'll wait until the cargo is actually transferred before moving in, but they need someone inside to confirm what's really happening. That someone being me, I said, my stomach churning with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Miranda, this is dangerous. These aren't white-collar criminals playing games with spreadsheets. If Victor's associates realize you're documenting their operation, then we better make sure they don't realize it, I interrupted, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. James, my son is walking into a trap. If I don't do this, if we don't get enough evidence to prove he was manipulated rather than complicit, Nathan could spend the rest of his life in prison. Or worse, James added grimly. The men I saw in those photographs don't leave loose ends. The phone rang at precisely 8:30, Nathan's voice bright with nervous energy on the other end. Mother, I wanted to let you know I'll be working very late tonight. This special contract I mentioned requires some unusual scheduling. Of course, dear, I replied, channeling every ounce of maternal warmth I could muster while my heart hammered against my ribs. Will Victor be with you? Oh, yes, he's coordinating everything. Mother, I have to tell you this deal could change everything for Sinclair Motors. We're talking about expanding into markets Father never dreamed of accessing. Markets that trafficked in human misery and federal crimes, but Nathan's enthusiasm was so genuine it broke my heart. Victor had convinced him he was building an empire when he was actually constructing his own prison. I'm so proud of you. I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Your father would be proud too. Thank you, Mother. That means everything to me. After I hung up, James and I spent the rest of the morning reviewing every detail of our plan. I would attend the special shipment operation as Nathan's concerned mother, bringing dinner for the hardworking employees. The food would be my cover for being at the docks, and the insulated delivery bags would conceal the recording equipment Agent Morrison had provided. At 4 o'clock, I was in Margaret Chen's kitchen preparing sandwiches and coffee for what I told her was an employee appreciation gesture. Margaret didn't ask questions, but I could see the worry in her eyes as she helped me pack the food into thermal containers. Miranda, she said quietly as we worked, the financial records I've been tracking show some very large transfers scheduled for tonight. Money moving through accounts I've never seen before, amounts that dwarf our usual transactions. How much money, Doug? $5 million. All of it flowing through Sinclair Motors accounts, but none of it connected to any legitimate contracts or services. $5 million. The magnitude of Victor's operation was staggering, and it explained why Nathan was so excited about the potential profits. What my son saw as the deal of a lifetime was actually the culmination of months of careful manipulation. Margaret, I said, gripping her hand tightly, if anything happens tonight, if Nathan and I don't come home, make sure the authorities get those financial records. Promise me. Nothing's going to happen, Xavier, she replied firmly, but her voice trembled slightly. You're going to expose these criminals and save Nathan from his own stupidity. I hoped she was right. The drive to the industrial district took 40 minutes, plenty of time for me to rehearse my performance and check the hidden recording devices one final time. The equipment was smaller and more sophisticated than I'd expected, a tiny camera disguised as a button on my coat, a microphone woven into the fabric of my scarf, and a GPS tracker hidden in my purse so the FBI could monitor my location. Dock 17 was part of a sprawling complex of warehouses and shipping facilities that served the city's port. During the day, it bustled with legitimate commerce trucks, loading and unloading cargo workers, moving containers, the constant symphony of industrial productivity. But at night, especially tonight, it would serve a very different purpose. I parked in the visitors area and gathered my bags of food, trying to project the image of a caring mother bringing dinner to her hardworking son. The security guard at the gate recognized me from previous company events and waved me through with a smile. "Evening, Mrs. Blake. Nathan said you might be stopping by with food for the crew." "Just trying to take care of my boy," I replied with what I hoped was a convincing maternal smile. "You know how these young executives forget to eat when they're focused on important deals." The guard chuckled and pointed toward a large warehouse at the end of the dock. "They're in Building 7. Quite a production they've got going on in there." A Building 7 was newer than the surrounding structures, with better lighting and more sophisticated security systems. As I approached, I could see several expensive cars parked outside vehicles that definitely didn't belong to Sinclair Motors employees. Victor's associates had arrived. Through the partially open loading dock, I could hear voices and see figures moving in the artificial brightness of industrial lighting. Nathan's voice carried over the others, animated and confident, still believing he was orchestrating a legitimate business transaction. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked into what might be the most important performance of my life. "Nathan," I called cheerfully as I entered the warehouse, my voice echoing in the vast space. "I brought dinner for everyone. I know you've been working so hard on this special project." The reaction was immediate and telling. Nathan looked genuinely pleased to see me, his face lighting up with the kind of grateful surprise that reminded me of the boy he'd once been. Victor, however, went rigid with barely concealed alarm, his eyes darting between me and his associates with obvious calculation. But it was the reaction of Victor's partners that confirmed my worst fears about the danger Nathan was in. 3 men I recognized from the Cardinal Club dinner, plus 2 others I didn't know, all of them studying me with the kind of predatory assessment that made my skin crawl. These weren't businessmen, they were predators who'd learned to wear expensive suits. "Mother, you didn't need to," Nathan started, but Victor cut him off smoothly. "How thoughtful of you, Mrs. Blake," Victor said, his accent slightly more pronounced than usual, a sign of stress, perhaps. "I'm afraid this is rather sensitive work, though. Corporate confidentiality and all that." "Oh, I understand completely," I replied, setting down the bags of food on a makeshift table. "I'll just set up the food and get out of your way. I know how important discretion is in high-level business negotiations." The warehouse was larger than it had appeared from outside, with several shipping containers positioned near the loading dock. Most were sealed and appeared to be standard cargo units, but one was open, revealing contents that made my blood freeze even as I forced my expression to remain pleasantly maternal. Crates. Dozens of wooden crates stamped with foreign markings being carefully loaded by men who moved with military precision. Whatever Victor was importing through Sinclair Motors' shipping network, it wasn't automotive parts or industrial equipment. "Mother, perhaps you should," Nathan began, but he was interrupted by the arrival of another man who made everyone else in the warehouse seem like amateurs. He was older, maybe 65, with silver hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of commanding absolute obedience. He wore an expensive overcoat despite the warm evening, and when he spoke, everyone else fell silent. "Victor, femme," he said, his accent unmistakably Eastern European. "You didn't mention we would have observers tonight." "Anton," Victor replied, and I caught the deference in his voice, the subtle shift in posture that marked him as a subordinate rather than an equal. "This is Nathan's mother. She was just dropping off food for the workers." Anton Kunov, The name hit me like a physical blow as I remembered James's intelligence reports. Anton Kenov, suspected head of one of the East Coast's most sophisticated criminal organizations, a man whose business interests allegedly ranged from money laundering to human trafficking to arms dealing, and my son was standing in a warehouse shaking hands with him like he was any other business partner. Mrs. Blake. Anton said, his English precise and cultured. How kind of you to think of our hardworking associates. Tell me, what do you know about your son's business ventures? The question was casual, almost conversational, but I could feel the menace underlying it. This was a test, and the wrong answer could put both Nathan and me in mortal danger. I know my son is brilliant at expanding into new markets. I replied carefully, letting my voice carry just the right note of maternal pride mixed with strategic ignorance. Nathan tells me you're helping Sinclair Motors access international opportunities that his father never could have imagined. Indeed, we are. Anton smiled, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. Your late husband built a very useful infrastructure: trucks, shipping, contracts, warehouses, all the logistics necessary for moving cargo efficiently and discreetly. Robert always believed in building relationships with the right people. I said the words coming out steadier than I felt. He would be so pleased to know Nathan is carrying on that tradition. I'm sure he would, Anton replied, and something in his tone suggested he knew exactly how Robert would have reacted to this scene. Nathan, your mother seems like a very understanding woman, very discreet. She is, Nathan said quickly, his voice carrying a note of protective urgency that surprised me. For all his coldness and betrayal, my son still didn't want to see me hurt. Mother understands that modern business requires a certain flexibility. Don't you, Mother? Of course, dear, I replied, all the while memorizing every detail of the warehouse, every face, every license plate visible through the open loading dock. The recording equipment hidden in my clothing was capturing everything, but I needed to see more, understand more, gather enough evidence to prove that Nathan was a victim rather than a perpetrator. Perhaps Mrs. Blake would like a tour. Anton suggested, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. Since she's so interested in her son's success. Victor looked alarmed, but Nathan nodded eagerly. Mother would love that. She's always been fascinated by the logistics side of the business. Wonderful, Anton said, gesturing toward the open shipping container. Then let me show you what international commerce really looks like. As we walked toward the container, I could feel the recording devices capturing everything: voices, faces, the details that would either save Nathan or condemn him. But I was also acutely aware that I was walking deeper into danger with every step. The contents of the shipping container were even more damning up close. The wooden crates were marked with Cyrillic text and shipping codes that definitely didn't originate from any legitimate supplier. Some of the crates had been opened, revealing contents that made my blood run cold. Not drugs as I had expected, but something worse. Weapons. Military-grade assault rifles, handguns, and what looked like enough ammunition to supply a small army. This wasn't just money laundering or even drug trafficking. This was arms dealing on an international scale. Impressive, isn't it? Anton said, watching my face carefully. Your son's transportation network has made it possible for us to serve customers throughout the region. Supply and demand, Mrs. Blake. Basic economics. Very impressive. I managed forcing admiration into my voice while my mind raced with the implications. Nathan wasn't just involved in financial crimes, he was unknowingly facilitating an arms trafficking operation that could destabilize entire communities. The beauty of the arrangement, Victor added, clearly proud of his strategic genius, is that Nathan handles all the legitimate paperwork while we manage the specialized cargo, complete compartmentalization of responsibilities. Nathan was nodding along, still believing he was learning about sophisticated business practices. It's brilliant, really. We handle the shipping and documentation, they handle the international coordination. Everyone plays to their strengths. And what happens if there are complications? I asked, trying to keep my tone curious rather than accusatory. With customs inspections or regulatory oversight, Anton's smile became genuinely terrifying. Complications are handled at our level, Mrs. Blake. Your son never needs to worry about such details. The casual way he discussed eliminating obstacles, whether bureaucratic or human, left no doubt about what kind of man we were dealing with. Nathan was working with people who solved problems through violence and intimidation, and he had no idea how expendable he was in their calculations. Speaking of complications, one of Anton's associates said, approaching our group with obvious urgency, we may have a problem. The man was younger, maybe 40, with the lean build and watchful eyes of someone who'd survived in dangerous professions. He spoke in rapid Russian to Anton, who listened with growing displeasure. What is it? Victor asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Federal surveillance, Anton replied calmly. Our contacts suggest there may be law enforcement interest in tonight's operation. The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 20 degrees. Nathan looked confused, still not understanding the magnitude of what he'd gotten himself into, but Victor had gone pale as death. That's impossible, Victor said. Our security is perfect. No one knows about this operation except authorized personnel. Someone always knows, Anton replied, his eyes scanning the warehouse with professional calculation. The question is whether they know enough to act or whether this is simply routine surveillance that can be managed. What do you mean managed? Nathan asked, and I could hear the first note of real concern creeping into his voice. I mean, my young friend, that federal investigations are like fires. Sometimes you can put them out quietly, and sometimes you need to eliminate the fuel that feeds them. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If the FBI moved tonight, if this operation was compromised, Anton would eliminate everyone who could testify against him, including Nathan, including me. Perhaps, Anton continued, still studying me with those cold, calculating eyes, we should consider whether all of our current associates are truly committed to discretion. What are you suggesting? Nathan's voice had gone sharp with alarm. I'm suggesting that trust is earned, not assumed, and that loose ends have a way of becoming serious problems. The warehouse fell silent, except for the sound of workers continuing to load crates, their efficiency a stark contrast to the deadly tension among the leadership. I could feel Anton's suspicion focusing on me like a laser, could sense his associates positioning themselves to control the situation if it spiraled out of hand. And somewhere in the darkness outside, FBI agents were waiting for the right moment to move, unaware that their target had just become suspicious of the very person who was providing them with evidence. Anton, Victor said carefully, Mrs. Blake has been nothing but supportive of our arrangement. She understands the importance of discretion. Does she? Anton's voice carried the casual tone of a man discussing the weather while planning murder. Tell me, Mrs. Blake, what would you do if federal agents asked you questions about your son's business activities? The question hung in the air like a blade. Answer wrong, and I'd sign both Nathan's death warrant and my own. Answer right, and I'd be committing to help cover up crimes that would destroy countless lives. I would tell them, I said quietly, meeting Anton's eyes with what I hoped looked like maternal determination, that my son is an honest businessman who works with international partners to expand American commerce. I would tell them that Nathan Blake has never knowingly broken a law and that anyone suggesting otherwise is clearly mistaken. It was the perfect answer because it was technically true. Nathan hadn't knowingly broken the law. He'd been manipulated into breaking it by people who'd convinced him that criminal enterprises were simply sophisticated business practices. Anton studied me for several long seconds, then smiled with what might have been genuine approval. Spoken like a true mother, he said, family loyalty is a quality I greatly admire. The immediate crisis passed, but the tension in the warehouse remained thick as smoke. Workers continued loading crates while the leadership group watched each other with the wary calculation of predators sharing the same territory. "How much longer?" Nathan asked, his voice carrying a note of anxiety that suggested he was finally beginning to understand that this wasn't a normal business transaction. "Another hour," Victor replied, checking his watch. "The final shipment needs to be secured before we can complete the transfer." Final shipment. I wondered what else they were expecting, what other illegal cargo would pass through Sinclair Motors' transportation network before the night was over. "Mother, Nathan said suddenly, "perhaps you should head home. This is taking longer than expected, and I know you have an early morning." And it was the perfect opportunity to escape to get clear of the warehouse before whatever was going to happen next. But I couldn't leave Nathan here alone, surrounded by criminals who would kill him without hesitation if they decided he was a liability. "I'm in no hurry," I said with a smile that felt like broken glass. "Besides, I want to see this historic deal completed. It's not every day a mother gets to witness her son's greatest business triumph." The words were like a knife in my heart, but they sold the performance. Anton laughed, actually laughed at my maternal pride. "Indeed," he said, "historic is certainly the word for it." As if summoned by his comment, another truck pulled up to the loading dock, this one unmarked and driven by men who moved with military precision. The final shipment, whatever it was, had arrived. "Excellent timing," Victor said, his confidence returning now that the operation was proceeding smoothly. "Nathan, would you like to inspect the final cargo as CEO? It's important that you understand exactly what Sinclair Motors is transporting." I watched in horror as my son nodded eagerly, still believing he was participating in legitimate international commerce. As we approached the truck, I could see that this cargo was different from the weapons' smaller crates, more carefully secured, handled with a level of caution that suggested extreme value or extreme danger. The truck driver, a man whose face belonged on wanted posters, opened the rear doors to reveal cargo that made everything else pale in comparison. Not drugs, not weapons, money, millions of dollars in cash neatly bundled and organized in fireproof containers. The kind of money that came from human trafficking, drug dealing, extortion, and every other criminal enterprise that generated profits too dirty to run through normal banking channels. $5 million, Anton said with obvious satisfaction, "ready for integration into legitimate business transactions. Your transportation network will move this to 3 different locations where it will become consulting fees, equipment purchases, and international partnership investments." Nathan stared at the cash with a mixture of awe and growing comprehension. Even he couldn't pretend this was normal business activity. "This is," he began, his voice trailing off as the implications hit him. "This is the future of American commerce," Victor said smoothly. "Global partnerships that transcend traditional regulatory boundaries." "This is money laundering, some," Nathan said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of loading equipment. The warehouse fell silent. Anton's smile disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator who just watched his prey discover the trap. "Yes," Anton said simply, "it is. And now, my young friend, you have a choice to make." The moment I'd been dreading had finally arrived. Nathan had discovered the truth about his business partners, about the sophisticated international commerce that Victor had been selling him for months. The question now was whether he would choose to run to fight or to become a willing participant in the criminal enterprise that had infected his father's company. "Nathan," I said quietly, my voice carrying all the love and desperation I felt, "remember what your father taught you about integrity. Remember what he would do." "Your father," Anton said, his voice cutting through my plea like a blade, "is dead. You have to live in the world as it is, not as it was." The next few seconds would determine whether my son was lost forever or whether there was still hope for redemption. And as I stood in that warehouse surrounded by criminals and illegal weapons and dirty money, I realized that everything we'd planned, Everything the FBI was preparing for depended on what Nathan Blake decided to do in this moment of truth. The war for his soul was about to begin. Nathan stood frozen between two worlds, the innocent realm where he'd believed he was building his father's legacy, and the criminal underworld that had been using him as their unwitting puppet. I could see the exact moment when the full weight of his situation crashed over him, the way his face went from confusion to horror to something that might have been relief. "I can't do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the force of a thunderclap in the sudden silence. "Whatever this is, whatever you people are really doing, I can't be part of it." Anton's expression shifted from casual menace to genuine interest, like a scientist observing an unexpected reaction in a laboratory experiment. "How unfortunate," he said softly. "And here I thought you were a practical businessman." "I am a businessman," Nathan replied, his voice gaining strength. "My father built Sinclair Motors on integrity, on honest work, on providing good jobs for good people. This—" He gestured at the money, the weapons, the criminal enterprise that had infected his company. "This would destroy everything he worked for." For the first time in months, I felt genuinely proud of my son. Robert's lessons had been buried under layers of ambition and manipulation, but they weren't gone. The boy who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on ants was still there somewhere beneath the corporate coldness, but pride wasn't going to keep us alive. Victor stepped forward, his face flushed with panic and desperation. "Nathan, you don't understand the complexities of what we're building here. This is bigger than Sinclair Motors, bigger than your father's small-town vision." "My father's vision built this company from nothing." Nathan shot back, his voice carrying an edge of the old Blake steel. "Your vision is going to destroy it and everyone who depends on it. Your vision," Anton corrected pleasantly, "is going to get you killed if you don't adjust your perspective." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and I could see Nathan processing the implications with growing horror. This wasn't a business disagreement that could be resolved through negotiation or legal action. These were people who eliminated obstacles permanently. "Anton," Victor said quickly, "Nathan just needs time to understand the benefits of our arrangement. Perhaps if we— Perhaps—" Anton interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "We've relied too heavily on Nathan's cooperation instead of ensuring his compliance." Two of Anton's associates moved casually but deliberately to block the warehouse exits, not rushing, not drawing weapons, just positioning themselves to control the situation if it escalated. These were professionals who'd done this before. "Mother," Nathan said quietly, his eyes meeting mine across the warehouse floor, "I'm sorry for everything. You were right to ask questions, right to be concerned. I should have listened to you." "Nathan," I replied, letting all my maternal love show in my voice. "Your father would be proud of you right now. You're choosing to do the right thing." "How touching," Anton said, pulling a phone from his coat pocket. "Unfortunately, family sentiment doesn't solve practical problems. Victor, I believe it's time for the secondary protocol." Secondary protocol. The phrase made my blood run cold as I remembered James's warnings about how criminal organizations dealt with compromised operations: clean up loose ends, eliminate witnesses, disappear without a trace. Victor's face went from panicked to terrified. "Anton, surely we can resolve this without extreme measures. Nathan's been cooperative. He's provided access to everything we needed." "And now he's threatening to withdraw that cooperation," Anton replied, still typing on his phone, "which makes him a liability, and you, Victor, have failed to properly manage that liability." And I could see Victor realizing that his own survival was now in question, that Anton viewed him as responsible for Nathan's rebellion. The beautiful thing about criminals, I realized, was that they could never really trust each other. "There has to be another way," Nathan said, his voice steady despite the obvious danger. "If you let my mother leave, if you let me transfer out of the CEO position quietly, no one has to know about tonight. You can find another company, another arrangement." Anton actually laughed. My dear boy, you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of this business. There are no quiet resignations, no peaceful transitions. You either continue to be useful or you cease to be a problem. That's when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, casting the warehouse in eerie red shadows, but those crucial seconds of darkness were enough to transform the entire situation. I heard shouting in multiple languages, the sound of heavy equipment being overturned, and somewhere in the chaos, a voice I recognized bellowing orders. FBI, nobody move hands where we can see them. The warehouse exploded into chaos. Anton's associates went for their weapons while FBI agents poured in through entrances I hadn't even known existed. Nathan grabbed my arm and pulled me behind a shipping container as gunfire erupted around us. Stay down, mother, he shouted over the sound of automatic weapons and tactical commands. Whatever happens, stay down. But I couldn't stay down. Not when I could see Victor scrambling toward an exit. Not when I realized that Anton had disappeared into the shadows like smoke. Not when I understood that the evidence we needed to prove Nathan's innocence might vanish in the confusion of the raid. The money, I shouted to Nathan over the gunfire. They need to see the money and the weapons. That's what proves you were set up. Nathan looked at me with something approaching awe. You did this. You brought the FBI here. I brought the FBI here to save you, I replied, pulling out the small recording device I'd been carrying. Everything from tonight is on here. Every conversation, every threat, every piece of evidence that proves you were manipulated. Before Nathan could respond, a new voice cut through the chaos with military precision. Miranda Nathan. This way, James appeared from behind another shipping container, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd trained for situations like this his entire life. He had an FBI windbreaker over his civilian clothes and was carrying the kind of weapon that suggested his involvement with Agent Morrison went deeper than I'd realized. James? Nathan stared at his godfather in confusion. What are you doing here? Saving your life, James replied curtly, gesturing for us to follow him. Move now. And we ran through the warehouse in a crouch, staying low, as FBI agents and criminals exchanged gunfire around us. The scene was surreal. My quiet life as a widow had somehow transformed into something from an action movie, complete with federal raids and international criminals. Agent Morrison met us at a secured exit, her professional composure intact despite the chaos around us. Mrs. Blake, I need that recording device, and Mr. Blake, I need you to stay exactly where the agents can protect you. What about Victor? I asked, passing her the recording equipment. What about Anton Kanov? Kozlov's in custody, she replied. Kanov is in the wind, but we'll get him. What matters right now is securing the evidence and making sure you both survive to testify. Testify? Nathan looked stricken. Agent Morrison, I had no idea what they were really doing. I thought, Mr. Blake, Agent Morrison interrupted. Based on the evidence your mother has gathered over the past month, we believe you were deliberately deceived about the nature of your business arrangements. That doesn't mean you won't face charges, but it does mean we're prepared to work with you. A month. She said a month, which meant Nathan was finally understanding the full scope of what had been happening. His mother hadn't just stumbled onto Victor's operation. She'd been investigating it systematically, building a case, working with federal agents to expose the truth. You've been spying on me, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of betrayal and admiration. For weeks, you've been pretending to be the broken widow while I was actually trying to save your life in your father's company, I finished. Nathan, everything Victor showed you, everyone he introduced you to, every deal he brought to the table, all of it was designed to make you the fall guy for their criminal operation. The gunfire was tapering off as FBI agents secured the warehouse, but I could hear Agent Morrison coordinating with other teams via radio. This wasn't just a local operation. They were simultaneously raiding locations across 3 states, dismantling an entire criminal network. How many people knew? Nathan asked quietly. How many people were working to save me from my own stupidity? Your father knew months before he died, Beau. James said, his voice gentle but firm. Margaret Chen suspected the financial irregularities. Agent Morrison's team had been building a case for 2 years. And your mother, he looked at me with something approaching reverence. Your mother risked her life tonight to gather the evidence that could clear your name. Could clear it? Nathan's voice went sharp with anxiety. What does that mean exactly? Agent Morrison rejoined our conversation, her expression professional but not unkind. Mr. Blake, you've unknowingly facilitated money laundering, arms trafficking, and several other federal crimes. The penalties for those charges, even if you were deceived, could include significant prison time. However, she continued, your mother's evidence clearly demonstrates that you were systematically lied to about the nature of these transactions. Combined with your cooperation tonight and your willingness to testify against Kozlov and his associates, we're prepared to recommend minimal charges with the possibility of supervised probation. Minimal charges. Supervised probation. It wasn't complete exoneration, but it was life instead of death, freedom instead of decades in federal prison. What about the company? Nathan asked, and I felt another surge of pride at his priorities. Even facing criminal charges, he was thinking about the employees who depended on Sinclair Motors. The company will face significant scrutiny, Agent Morrison admitted. There will be investigations, audits, possible civil penalties. But if it's managed properly, if the criminal elements are completely purged, Sinclair Motors could survive this. Managed by whom? Nathan's voice carried a note of resignation. I can't exactly continue as CEO after tonight. Agent Morrison looked at me meaningfully. That would depend on who has legal authority to assume control of the company's operations. The trust documents Robert had prepared, the contingency plans he'd hoped would never be necessary. Suddenly, they weren't just theoretical legal instruments. They were the tools that could rebuild everything Victor had corrupted. Mother, Nathan said quietly, understanding dawning in his eyes, you could take over the company. You could save it. We could save it, I corrected. Together. After you've served whatever sentence the court imposes, after you've learned from this experience, we could work together to rebuild what your father created. For the first time in months, Nathan smiled with genuine warmth. I'd like that. I'd like to learn how to be the kind of man father was, the kind of son you deserve. The warehouse had grown quiet, except for the sound of FBI agents processing evidence and securing the scene. Through the loading dock, I could see dawn beginning to break over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility. Agent Morrison handed me a business card and a thick folder. Mrs. Blake, you'll need to come in for formal debriefing tomorrow. And Mr. Blake, you'll need a good lawyer. But based on what happened tonight, based on your cooperation and your mother's evidence, I think you both have reasons to be optimistic. The ride home took place in relative silence, all of us processing what had happened and what came next. Nathan sat beside me in the back of James's truck, looking younger than he had in years, like the weight of Victor's manipulation had been lifted from his shoulders. Mother, he said as we pulled into the driveway of Sinclair Manor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Of course. When I left you on that highway, when I drove away and left you standing in the rain, did you ever think about just giving up, just letting me destroy everything Father built? I considered the question seriously, remembering the fury and desperation I'd felt standing in that storm, the moment when I decided to fight back instead of surrender. For about 5 minutes, I admitted. And then I remembered that you're still my son, still Robert's son, and still worth saving, even when you don't believe it yourself. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking slightly. For all of it. For not listening to you, for trusting the wrong people, for almost destroying everything that mattered. Nathan, I replied, taking his hand in mine. Your father made mistakes when he was building this company. I made mistakes raising you. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, It's whether they learn from them and do better. Do you think I can do better? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the cold stranger who had abandoned me on a highway, but the boy who had once promised to take care of me when his father was gone, wounded by his own choices but not broken, humbled by experience but not defeated. I think, I said carefully, that you're about to discover what you're really made of. The next several months unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of justice and redemption. Viktor Kozlov was convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Anton Kanov was captured in Miami 3 weeks after the warehouse raid and faced extradition to face charges in 4 different countries. Nathan pled guilty to conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. It was a harsh lesson, but it was life and it was hope. More importantly, it was time for him to understand what his father had really built and why it was worth preserving. I assumed control of Sinclair Motors under the trust provisions Robert had so carefully prepared, working with a team of investigators and auditors to purge every trace of criminal influence from the company's operations. It was exhausting, heartbreaking work, but it was also deeply satisfying to see Robert's vision slowly emerging from the wreckage Victor had created. Margaret Chen became my chief financial officer, bringing her meticulous attention to detail and uncompromising integrity to every aspect of the company's rebuilding process. James took a consulting position using his military expertise to overhaul our security procedures and ensure that no future criminal organization could infiltrate our operations. The hardest part wasn't the business restructuring or the legal proceedings or even the financial losses from canceled contracts and civil penalties. The hardest part was visiting Nathan in federal prison and seeing the man he was becoming through adversity and reflection. I've been reading Father's journals, he told me during one visit, his orange prison uniform a stark reminder of how far he'd fallen. The warden let me access his business writings, his thoughts about building the company. What did you learn? That I never really understood what he was trying to build, Nathan replied. I thought success meant growth and profits and market dominance. But Father was trying to create something that would last, something that would provide good jobs and serve the community for generations. And now I understand the difference between building an empire and building a legacy. Those words, more than any legal resolution or financial recovery, told me that my son was finding his way back to the values Robert had tried to teach him. It would take time and there would be setbacks, but Nathan Blake was finally becoming the man his father had hoped he would be. 18 months later, I stood in the parking lot of the Federal Correctional Facility, waiting for Nathan's release. James was with me as he'd been through everything, steady and supportive and carrying the wisdom of someone who'd seen men fall and rise again. Nervous? He asked. Hopeful, I replied. For the first time in years, I'm genuinely hopeful. Nathan emerged from the facility carrying a single duffel bag and wearing civilian clothes that hung loose on his frame. Prison had changed him, not broken him, but refined him like metal forged in fire and hammered into something stronger than it had been before. Mother, he said, embracing me with genuine warmth, thank you for not giving up on me, for saving the company, for showing me what real strength looks like. Thank James, I replied. He's the one who never stopped believing you could be redeemed. I thanked him already, Nathan said, grinning at his godfather. Every week in letters. Poor man probably got tired of my apologies and promises to do better. Never tired of them, James replied gruffly. Just wanted to make sure you meant them. I meant them, and I intend to prove it. The drive back to the city took us past the Sinclair Motors headquarters, past the factories where our employees, our people, were building automotive parts and supporting their families. Nathan stared out the window at the familiar sights, seeing them perhaps for the first time, as his father had seen them, not as assets to be exploited, but as responsibilities to be honored. What's my role going to be? He asked. I mean, assuming the board approves my return to the company. You'll start in quality control, Owen, I said, enjoying his surprised expression. Learning the business from the ground up the way your father did, understanding every aspect of what we do and why we do it. Quality control, from CEO to quality control inspector. From criminal defendant to honest worker, I corrected. It's a promotion, Nathan. You'll be contributing something valuable instead of just taking what others have built. And if I prove myself, if I show that I've really learned from this experience, then maybe in a few years we can discuss management positions. But Nathan, you'll never be CEO again unless you earn it through demonstrated competence and integrity. The days of inherited authority are over. Good, he said, surprising me. I don't want authority I haven't earned. I want to build something worth inheriting. That evening, we had dinner at Sinclair Manor, just Nathan, James, and me, sitting around the same table where Victor had threatened me, and Nathan had betrayed everything his father stood for. But the house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if Robert's spirit could finally rest, knowing his legacy was in good hands. There's something I want to show you, I said after dinner, leading Nathan to Robert's study. The room had been cleaned and reorganized, but I'd kept his desk exactly as he'd left it, complete with the fountain pen he'd used to sign contracts and the family photo that had watched over 30 years of business decisions. From the desk drawer, I pulled out a letter, not one of the documents Robert had left for the crisis, but something else entirely. A letter addressed to Nathan, dated just weeks before Robert's death. He knew he was sick, Nathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He suspected. The heart attack was sudden, but his doctors had warned him about stress and overwork. I handed him the letter. He wrote this hoping you'd never need to read it, but asking me to give it to you if you ever lost your way. Nathan opened the envelope with shaking hands and read silently for several minutes, tears streaming down his face. When he finished, he handed the letter to me. My dear son Robert had written, "If you're reading this, it means you've made choices that have brought pain to yourself and others. It means the man I tried to raise has been temporarily lost in the fog of ambition and poor judgment. But I want you to know that being lost doesn't mean being condemned. Some of the strongest men I've ever known were once broken by their own mistakes. What matters isn't the falling, it's the getting back up. You are my son, Nathan Blake, and that means you carry the best of both your mother and me. Miranda's strength, her wisdom, her unshakable moral compass. My determination, my vision for what this company could become. But most importantly, you carry your own unique gifts, your own capacity for greatness. Don't try to be me, son. Be the best version of yourself. Learn from failure instead of being destroyed by it. Choose integrity over profit relationships, over transactions, legacy over short-term gain. The company will survive whatever mistakes you make. What matters is whether you survive them too and whether you emerge from them as a better man than you were before. I love you. I believe in you. And I'm proud of who you're going to become. Your father, Robert." "He knew," Nathan said quietly. "Even then, he knew I was going to fall." "He knew you were human," I replied. "He knew that everyone makes mistakes, and he wanted to make sure you knew the way back home. And now you get to prove him right about who you're going to become." 2 years later, I stood in the boardroom of Sinclair Motors looking out at faces that represented everything Robert had dreamed of building. Employees who'd worked for the company for decades, community leaders who understood our commitment to ethical business practices, and board members who'd helped guide us through the most challenging period in our history. Nathan sat at the far end of the conference table, no longer the entitled CEO who'd nearly destroyed everything but a quality control manager who'd earned respect through competence and integrity. He'd just presented a comprehensive report on manufacturing improvements that would save the company millions of dollars while improving working conditions for our employees. "Excellent work, Nathan," said Dr. Helen Rodriguez, our new board chair. "Your recommendations show exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need in our senior leadership." "Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez." But I want to be clear, these improvements were developed by the entire quality control team. I just helped coordinate the research and present the findings. Leadership without ego, accomplishment without arrogance. Robert would have been so proud. Which brings us to our final agenda item, Dr. Rodriguez continued. The board has been discussing succession planning for the CEO position. Miranda, you've done an extraordinary job rebuilding this company, but we know you've always viewed your role as temporary. I've been honored to serve, I replied. But yes, my goal has always been to restore Sinclair Motors to health and then transition leadership to someone who can guide its future growth. The board has identified several qualified candidates, Dr. Rodriguez continued, including external executives with impressive credentials and proven track records. But we'd also like to consider promoting from within, recognizing talent that has been developed and tested right here at Sinclair Motors. Nathan looked up, his expression carefully neutral. He knew what was being discussed, but he also knew that any leadership position would have to be earned rather than inherited. Dr. Rodriguez, I said, if the board is considering internal candidates, I'd like to recommend Nathan Blake for consideration as Chief Operating Officer, with the understanding that he would need to demonstrate sustained excellence in that role before any discussion of CEO succession. The board shares your assessment, Dr. Rodriguez replied. Mr. Blake, would you be interested in accepting the COO position with all the responsibilities and accountability that position entails? Nathan was quiet for several moments, weighing the offer and its implications. Finally, he looked directly at me. I'd be honored to serve in whatever capacity the board feels is appropriate, he said. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not the same man who nearly destroyed this company 3 years ago. I've learned that leadership isn't about power or privilege, it's about service. Service to our employees, to our community, to the legacy my father built. And if you're ever offered the CEO position, Dr. Rodriguez asked, then I'll accept it only if I'm truly the best person for the job, not because of my name or my family connections. Sinclair Motors deserves leadership that's earned, not inherited. The vote was unanimous. Nathan Blake, former federal prisoner and recovered criminal defendant, became Chief Operating Officer of Sinclair Motors, with the understanding that his future would be determined by his performance rather than his pedigree. After the meeting, Nathan and I walked through the factory floor together, observing the controlled chaos of American manufacturing at its best. Workers who'd known Nathan since he was a child nodded respectfully as we passed, but their respect was earned rather than automatic. Proud of you, I said as we reached the executive parking area. I'm proud of us, Nathan replied. Mother, what you did investigating Victor, working with the FBI, risking your life to save mine, I don't think I'll ever fully understand how much courage that took. You do the same for your children when you have them. I hope so. I hope I can be the kind of parent you and Father were even when I didn't deserve it. Nathan, I said, stopping and turning to face him directly, you always deserved love. What you didn't deserve was to escape the consequences of your choices. There's a difference. I understand that now. Consequences aren't punishment, they're education. Exactly. And now you get to use that education to build something worthy of your father's memory. We stood there for a moment, mother and son, looking back at the company that had nearly destroyed us and ultimately saved us both. Robert's dream tested by fire and refined by adversity, but stronger now than it had ever been. Ready to go home? I asked. Ready to build a future, Nathan replied. And as we drove through the city, Robert had loved past the neighborhoods where our employees lived, and the schools where their children learned, and the parks where families gathered on weekends. I knew that the most important battle of my life had been won, not through force or deception, but through the patient, persistent application of love and justice and unwavering faith in the possibility of redemption. My son was home. The company was secure. And somewhere, somehow, I could feel Robert's approval warming the evening air like sunlight after a storm. The lesson Nathan had tried to teach me on that rain-soaked highway, that I was powerless, disposable, irrelevant, had become his own education in the true nature of strength. Real power didn't come from discarding the people who loved you. It came from cherishing them, protecting them, and earning their respect through your actions rather than demanding it through your authority. Miranda Blake, abandoned widow, had become Miranda Blake, corporate savior and mother of the year. But most importantly, I'd become the woman Robert always knew I could be strong enough to save everyone I loved, including from themselves. The storm had passed. The sun was rising. And after all the pain and betrayal and redemption, the Blake family was finally truly home.